Chess kids, let's continue our journey down the E4 lane. What's the next stop on our highway? Well, we've talked about E5 in our first couple of videos. Last time, we talked about C5, the Sicilian, and now let's take a look at an opening that, I'll be honest with you, I may not have even mentioned very much a couple of years ago, but a lot of the famous chess YouTubers are talking about it. That would be pawn to C6. That's right, that's what the cool kids are playing. A lot of famous content creators are talking about this move, so it makes sense for us to devote an entire video to it. This is the Caro Kann defense. Who's afraid of the hyphen? Well, if you are, hopefully you won't be in about 20 minutes, because I'm going to teach you a very simple system for how to deal with this move. It's actually a system I've been teaching kids for many years, and I see no reason to change. Today, I'm going to teach it to you. No surprise, when someone plays an opening that does not grab control of the center and lets you play the snowplow, the two pawns side by side, you should pretty much always do it. And no surprise, I'm going to recommend you play pawn to D4. Now, black always plays D5. I don't even know what else black would play. Black has to plant a flag in the middle of the board at some point. Now comes a major split. Do we push the pawn? Do we defend the pawn? If we defend the pawn, do we put the knight here? Or do we put the knight here? Or do we play a really crazy move like pushing your f-pawn without my written permission to defend? That's actually called the fantasy variation. And you know what? Every single one of these moves has been played before by top players, but I'm not going to teach you any of them. Oh no, it's a secret move. It's so secret. But it's not going to be a secret in about 5 seconds, because chess kids, what I'd like you to do, let's wipe away the arrows. I want you to play the exchange variation. Of course, it's not a real secret, but it is the opening that I want you to play. Now, it makes zero sense for black to take back with the queen. If the queen takes, you could just start pouncing on the queen with knight c3, gaining a lead in development, and there's no way that a self-respecting Caro Kann player would ever take with the queen. They would always take with the pawn to keep their respect. Okay, now we're gonna take a pause in this position, because when you're first learning how to play chess, we don't put too much emphasis on which back row pieces you get out first, as long as it's knights and bishops. So in the old days, back when you were a little guy or girl just learning how to play chess, if you played a move like knight c3, I would pat you on the back and I would say, great job. Or if you played knight f3, great job. Or if you move this bishop anywhere, cool beans. Or if you move that bishop, awesome sauce. But today it's different, because when you're learning exact openings, I want you to memorize specific moves, but I want you to also understand the ideas behind those moves. Now, if you ever get in the exchange variation of the Caro Kann and you see this position, there's one major thought I want you to have in your mind. And that thought, of course, is, how do I get tiramisu onto Funmaster Mike's dinner plate? But after that thought, which is obvious at this point, the second thought should be, how do I make this bishop a bad piece? Why are we targeting that bishop? Well, it's not nice to be a bully in real life, we know that, but we're gonna bully this bishop a little bit. We want to develop in an exact way so that that bishop doesn't get to move to any good squares. Now, let's focus on the bishop, okay? Where does the bishop want to go? Well, the bishop's not very excited about that square. It just blocks the queen, and that diagonal is not very exciting. Now, the bishop could go 2 squares, but if the bishop goes 2 squares, that's even worse. It blocks the pawn, which blocks the bishop. That's a traffic jam. That's no bueno. Bishop f5 would be a solid square for the bishop. The bishop is aiming not only at the middle of the board, but also down here at this c2 pawn, and that's probably where black's rook is going to land one day, because that's a half-open file. That's a really awesome space for the bishop. Also, the bishop would not mind coming to g4 if it could safely, especially if there was a knight on f3 that was being pinned. Of course, the bishop better not move to g4 right now, because the queen is waiting. So, bishop f5, we know that is the money square for the bishop. What white move would take away the f5 square? Well, it's all becoming clear now. Bishop to d3, that's the move I want you to play. In chess, we often say knights before bishops, but there's a little bit of an exception here. We are developing the bishop before the knight because we want to control that square. Now, black might play knight f6 or knight c6, okay? In fact, black will often move these 2 knights out on the next 2 turns, but let's pretend that black plays knight c6, because this is a little bit more of a critical decision for white. The knight, when it moves to c6, it is eyeballing my tiramisu. The knight wants to capture that pawn on the next turn. normally I would tell you to bring a new piece out to develop to defend that pawn. And of course, the knight is waiting to come to the square f3. But remember our rule. We want to be a bully to this bishop, a nice bully, a benevolent bully. We want this bishop to not have any fun. And if we play knight f3, you guessed it, the bishop will charge out to the g4 square. And it's not like white has lost, but I think black has already at least equalized, because with the knight pinned, our pawn is back in danger. And even if the worst thing happens and black takes that knight one day to give up the bishop pair, when black plays a move like e6, even though black won't have a light squared bishop, black will have a very solid wall of pawns on light squares to make up for the fact that black lost the light squared bishop, and I think black will be doing really okay after the bishop takes the knight. Of course, the bishop's not in a hurry to take the knight because the bishop is pinning the knight, so the bishop is better than the knight. Let's go back. So we simply do not want to bring the knight to this square because we lose control over g4. We want the queen to guard g4. We do not want to lose control. You don't want to lose yourself, okay? So what else can we do? Well, we got to guard this pawn. Bishop e3 is okay, but our bishop is what we call a giant pawn, not actually a nice term for the bishop. When the bishop lands on e3, all it's doing is connecting some pawns in a pawn chain, and we are reducing the bishop's power to a pawn. This bishop really wants to come to f4 one day and aim at the middle of the chessboard. So, long story, even longer, we're going to play c3. c3 defends. It keeps the knight out of this square, so the knight can never go after our bishop. And also, our queen very often uses this diagonal to come out to one of these two squares. So c3 is a multi-purpose move. Okay, now let's have black play the move knight to f6. At the end of the video, I'm going to come back and talk to you about a modern treatment of this position where black does something to sort of try to get in the way of white's known plans, but that's really a master level idea. Let's go over the more common idea in kids chess, which is black just moving the knight out to its totally normal square. And by the way, knight f6 is not bad or anything like that. Okay, now we need to keep developing. You know I don't want you to play knight f3 because bishop g4 is still happening. If we develop this knight, actually d2 is not a bad square at all, because when this knight comes to f3, often this knight jumps to e5, and then the other knight backs up the first knight. That's actually where you want your knights. The problem is, if you put your knight on d2, Mr. Bishop's not very happy with you. So let's find a great spot for this bishop, and you guessed it, bishop to f4 is what I want you to do. Now comes a major split. The black team finally acquired a square for the bishop. The bishop can in fact go to g4 because the knight backs up the bishop. Or black could play the move e6 to help this bishop get out, but that permanently puts this bishop in a bad spot. I would argue that e6 is the weaker move, although bishop to g4, black has to really know what he or she is doing to stay out of trouble. So we're going to cover both moves. Which one do you want me to do first? Let's take a vote. I want you to hire an airplane and draw an airplane message in the sky with your vote. Kids, I'm just kidding. But in case mom or dad owns an airplane and flies up in the sky, once again, please drop me a tiramisu for dessert. Okay, let's go over e6 first. Why? I simply don't know. I had to pick one of them. e6 is actually quite a poor move because this bishop is now blocked in, and white gets to enjoy an attack on the king side for the rest of the game on the light squares because that bishop is a really bad piece. In fact, I once had a student win a game in about, 7 more moves in this position based on the weakness of the king side for black. So let's just play the move knight f3. There's no reason to delay anymore. Bishop cannot jump over the pawn to get to g4. Bishops do not pole vault over things. Only the great Sergei Bubka is able to pole vault. And that's an obscure athletics reference, but I'll bet you my producer has found an obscure picture of Mr. Sergei Bubka. Okay, let's continue on. Black might just play bishop to e7 to continue the development. Now we can play the move knight to d2. Remember our pattern? This knight wants to go here. The other knight wants to back up the first knight. Let's say the black castles. And in this position, you have a very enjoyable position for white. You can go ahead and castle if you want, or since the center is not exactly open, you don't have to be in a huge hurry to castle. You could go ahead and play a move like knight to e5. And the problem for black is that this knight is both simultaneously super annoying, but also not really a knight that you ever want to capture. Because if you do capture the knight, I'm actually going to take back with the pawn, and this knight is going to have to go backward. And when that knight goes backward, you're going to have almost no defense of the h7 square, and really, really bad things are going to happen to you. In referencing that game that my student played a few minutes ago, he actually had this happen to him, bishop to d7, because the bishop had to get off the back row. Then he took the first knight to back up the second knight, or is it the second knight backing up the first knight? Who's to say? Then black played the very weird move, rook over, and what ended up happening was, when this knight ended up taking, the pawn took, and when this knight moved, we had the classic Greek gift sacrifice on h7. Needless to say, if you ever get a position like this, it is great for white, and we're just going to go ahead and stop here. Or, you know what I could do? I could just show you what happens if the knight gets captured. If the knight goes to e5, if it gets captured right away, we can take back with the pawn. The knight goes to d7. And now, what I like to do in this position is just go ahead and play queen h5. Go ahead and threaten the checkmate. No sacrifice required. And when black gets out of the checkmate, let's say the black plays the move g6, then you can put your queen on h6, and look at your bishops targeting the black king. This knight is going to hop in the action. You could also use your h-pawn as a lever, h4, h5, trade, get your rook in the game. You might even castle to the queen side in this position to get both rooks in the game. And not only is white better, but from a practical standpoint, it is so much of an easier position for white to play. So we are definitely enjoying life. Let's go back to the move bishop to f4, and let's talk about what happens if black does not play e6, which is a very passive move. If black plays bishop to g4, as I mentioned, black can finally play this move. Now the funny thing is, we're going to switch the pendulum. Instead of attacking the light squares on the king side, now that this bishop has traveled to the king side, we're going to go after the light squares on the queen side. That's the crossover light square attack. And Mr. Allen Iverson, my favorite chess player, would be proud. We're faking right, we're going left, and I want you to put the queen on the square b3. Now, black can do a lot of things in this position. We're not actually afraid of knight a5. If black plays knight a5 to defend this pawn, you can just give a little check. And if black blocks, let's say with the bishop, you can actually just bring your queen back. And even though your queen is moved 3 times in a row, black is moving pieces backward, black is moving pieces to the edge of the board, and we'll just stop here and say that white is doing pretty decent. Let's go back. What else could black do to defend this pawn right here? Well, one idea is to move the queen. Now, queen c8 is the superstar and yet not at all obvious move. Most kids are going to put their queen on d7 because it usually makes sense to put the queen off the back row to defend. The problem with putting the queen here, remember our little knight tango. This knight wants to one day land on e5, and when it does, it will be templing the queen. Now don't be hasty. Don't play knight f3, because the bishop will take, and when you take back with your pawn, you're going to have double isolani's. So let's bring the queen's knight out first, and then when this knight moves here, it will have a backup knight. We will have a friend in low places. Okay, that was a very obscure and perhaps the only country music joke I will ever make on YouTube. Okay, thank you, Mr. Garth Brooks, for letting me use that one. Let's say black plays e6. Now, this knight can move to f3. We actually don't ever care in this position if the bishop takes the knight, because our other knight will simply take back. Okay, so it's not going to affect our planning in any way. Now, in this position, let's say that black puts the bishop on the square e7. This is what I was telling you about a moment ago. Your knight gets to hop into e5, and this is another one of those annoying knights. Annoying for black, not annoying for you. It's a very prideful knight for you. Your knight is an awesome piece. You could get rid of the bishop pair. You could take this knight and try to wreck black's pawns. You could try to put your bishop on b5 and your queen on a5 to triple attack this knight. Or, what is kind of likely to happen is that your opponent is frustrated at the strength of your knight and decides to chop it off the board, but that's exactly what we want. Funnily enough, I would almost always tell you positionally to capture with the bishop and keep the bishop unblocked. But there's a tactic if you take with the pawn. And the tactic is that you win a tempo on the knight, and if that knight chooses to save itself, there's no glory in that, because if the knight moves literally anywhere on the board, so we go back to g8, now bishop to b5 wins the queen, and look at that. We tricked this bishop into moving to the king side, and we win on the queen side on the light squares. I've seen so many kids win chess games with this exact tactic. I also want to mention, if we go back to this position, if your opponent does not take and puts the queen on c7, The queen is simply lining up with your bishop, and there's a couple of winning moves. I thought originally knight g6 is the simplest because we discover attack the queen while guarding the bishop, and we can take the rook on the next turn. If you want to be even more complicated, you can take this bishop. Although that does not defend our bishop, it distracts the black queen away from this pawn, and white is winning a lot of material after queen takes b7. Okay, so if we go all the way back, we have to hit the giant, way back button, and we go back to this position. We've talked briefly about knight a5. We've talked about queen d7 and all the fun we're going to have getting a knight to e5. What if black plays b6? This is not a good move at all, but again, I want you to know how to win chess games quickly, and I think you are going to win quickly after b6. Now here's the rule in chess. When a pawn moves, it always weakens the squares beside it. And by now you've probably realized we're going to hurt this knight badly. And that knight is on a light square. But if you make your intention too obvious, black might just have a chance to defend. So if you go ahead and pin the knight right away, if you play bishop b5, black is going to realize the game you're playing, and black is going to move the bishop back to d7 and probably survive. Even though black's position is not very fun, it's at least slightly solid. So let's go back. We're going to pretend that we don't notice that the knight is undefended. La da 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 da, nothing to see here, nothing to see. We're going to just continue our development. Now remember, knight f3, not a good move, because our knight will get chopped and we'll end up with double Isolani's. So I want you to play knight d2 first, very similar to something we talked about a moment ago. And 99.9% of all chess kids are going to pick vanilla or chocolate ice cream. Well, while that's true, that has nothing to do with this position, but I will say that 99.8% of chess kids will play e6 in this position to develop this bishop on the next turn. How do I know that? Well, I've asked tons of kids over the years, what's black going to do here? And pretty much everyone says e6. That's the exact move I want black to play. Why? Because now the bishop cannot pole vault backward and do a reverse Sergei Bubka. A Bubka Sergei? No, that does not exist in chess. The bishop cannot go back to d7. So now we realize our real intentions and we win this knight. It's actually game, set, match. Game is bishop b5. We don't care how black defends the knight. Let's say black uses the rook. Set is queen a4, double attacking the knight. Queen d7 is really the only defensive move. And in game, set, match, we need to win the third set. And here we're just going to get a knight to e5 and triple attack this poor pinned knight. We're just going to play knight f3. It's actually game over. We don't even care if black takes our knight because we have a backup knight. And this knight's going to e5, and even though black has a totally free move, there's nothing black can do. I mean, I guess black could play knight to g4 and temporarily defend, but we'll just play the no parking sign, force the knight to move, and we'll play knight e5 next. Even if black plays bishop d6, hoping that we play knight e5 and our knight gets chopped, we're just going to take the bishop first, and when the queen takes, now we're going to play knight e5, and we are Roger Federer. It is game, set, match on this night. We are winning on the light squares on the queen side. Once you win a major piece, you're just going to trade into the endgame. You're going to shake your endgame boogie, and white is going to win this game. So we love it when our opponent plays b6. I want to show you that one more time, though. This is a very strange and uncommon idea in chess. Usually, when someone makes a weakness, as black did here by playing b6, we go right after the weakness. But you have to show that little bit of patience until black plays e6. That way, black cannot get smart all of a sudden and bring the bishop back to d7. And for all the adults watching, yes, I'm aware there was a 1960s TV show called Get Smart. And no, I don't have any quotes from that TV show. It is shameful. I will work on it. I will improve. Okay, one more thing. I did mention that you might play some kind of superstar chess player who knows the modern treatment of this position. Because black was playing knight f6, bishop f4 all those years and experiencing, let's call it some difficulties, the modern kid, that is probably a chess master if they know this move, plays the move queen c7.
Hello.
Very clever. The reason I call this a master move is because most kids don't develop their queen on the fifth move of the game, and do so in such a clever way as to stop your bishop from landing on f4 because the queen is spying the f4 square. But that doesn't mean you're lost or anything. It just means we have to change our plans a little bit. In this position, the most clever move, the one I want you to play, is h3. By playing h3, we keep the bishop out of the g4 square, so our knight can come to f3. Now, I don't normally advise you to push pawns on the side of the board, but you know what? Black has kind of broken the first rule first by putting the queen on c7. That's why I think h3 is probably an okay move to make. Now, black is probably going to play knight f6, right? Black has to continue developing. We're going to play knight f3. We don't have to worry about bishop to g4. And in this position, black might very well get frustrated and play e6. Now, I do want to mention that, again, if you're playing a superstar chess master, the modern idea is to play g6 and actually put the bishop on f5 and allow you to take. And when you take back, black willingly gives himself double pawns. If somebody plays that against you, they're probably not even a master, they're probably a grandmaster. I'm just going to go ahead and say it. And again, you're not worse or anything, but we're just not going to expect such an opening. And because YouTube probably doesn't want me to do a 3-hour video, and your parents probably don't want either, because you have to eat dinner and brush your teeth and go to sleep at some point, we're just going to talk about the developing move e6. Now, I don't know if you think, hey, Funmaster Mike, that's not very common. Actually, you know what? It was once played against Magnus Carlsen. So yeah, it kind of is common. Now, Magnus just decided to castle in this position. And then after bishop to d6, he put his rook on e1. You can see what he's gearing up for. Black is trying to keep this knight out of the e5 square, and Magnus is insisting that he's gonna be able to get his knight to e5, and then this knight wants to back up the other knight. Very, very similar plans to ones that we've already talked about. So Magnus's opponent played b6 again, kind of a sad bishop. Magnus played knight to d2. This bishop, I suppose, could have come out to the g5 square, but there was a little bit of a problem, actually. If we go back, I do want to explain this because I think a lot of kids have played bishop to g5 in this position. One of the dangers of bishop to g5, I suppose, is that h6 might happen. And now, if you go back to h4, then g5 is going to happen, and you can't even put your bishop on this square because black has a battery aiming at it. So back to this position, you could take the knight, but after pawn takes, this rook is going to come to the g file and go after your king, and black can still castle to the queen side later in the game. I'm not saying black is winning or anything like that, but there's a little bit of a danger to this position. So that's why Magnus did not play the bishop to g5. Instead, he played knight to d2. The bishop came to b7. The queen came to e2, and now you can see Magnus is getting what he wants. This knight is going to be safe when it lands on e5, and this knight is going to be able to back up the other knight. Now, black decided to castle in this position. Knight to e5 did happen. Rook on a to e8. Now, this bishop came back to b1. The idea of putting the bishop on b1 is that the queen can take the bishop's place, and the queen and the bishop can go after the h7 pawn for an eventual checkmate. You could imagine if the queen gets here and you play a move like knight to g4 to distract this knight, we're getting pretty close to a checkmate on the h7 square. Now, black finally said, I've had enough of you, Mr. Knight. I'm going to play knight to d7, trying to get rid of it. But Magnus said, that's cool, and just backed up the first knight with the second knight. And this is a very enjoyable position for white to play. We've got two bishops aiming at black's kingside. We've got a knight that can almost never be removed. And by the way, if black ever pushes the pawn to f6, that makes the e6 pawn what we call a backward pawn, and that would be a new weakness. And Magnus doesn't need much more than that to win a chess game. You give him a permanent weakness, and he's going to go to town on it. So we're not going to look at the rest of the game. Magnus did go on to win this game. And really, the whole point of the YouTube series is not to show you how to win every single game. Otherwise, Magnus will watch my videos. It's mostly to get you to a reasonable chess position. And I think this is more than reasonable. I think that white is doing just fine in this position. So who's afraid of the Caro Kann? Who's afraid of that hyphen? Certainly not you. I hope that if those chess YouTubers have your opponents playing the Caro Kann, that you feel just as prepared how to meet it. Up next, we're going to go over some of the last options after e4 that we haven't covered yet. Go continue on your chess journey, chess kids. We'll be back shortly on YouTube.